Chapter 33, Part 1 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Illich. Chapter 33, Conquest of Africa by the Vandals. Part 1. Death of Honorius, Valentinian III, Emperor of the East, administration of his mother Placidia, Aetius and Boniface, conquest of Africa by the Vandals. During a long and disgraceful reign of 28 years, Honorius, Emperor of the West, was separated from the friendship of his brother, and afterwards of his nephew, who reigned over the East, and Constantinople beheld, with apparent indifference and secret joy, the calamities of Rome. The strange adventures of Placidia gradually renewed and cemented the alliance of the two empires. The daughter of the great Theodosius had been the captive and the queen of the Goths. She lost an affectionate husband, she was dragged in chains by his insulting assassin, she tasted the pleasure of revenge, and was exchanged, in the treaty of peace, for 600,000 measures of wheat. After her return from Spain to Italy, Placidia experienced a new persecution in the bosom of her family. She was averse to a marriage, which had been stipulated without her consent, and the brave Constantius, as a noble reward for the tyrants whom he had vanquished, received, from the hand of Honorius himself, the struggling and reluctant hand of the widow of Adolphus. But her resistance ended with the ceremony of the nuptials. Nor did Placidia refuse to become the mother of Honoria and Valentinian III, or to assume and exercise an absolute dominion over the mind of her grateful husband. The generous soldier, whose time had hitherto been divided between social pleasure and military service, was taught new lessons of avarice and ambition. He extorted the title of Augustus, and the servant of Honorius was associated to the emperor of the West. In the 7th month of his reign, instead of diminishing, seemed to increase the power of Placidia, and the indecent familiarity of her brother, which might be no more than the symptoms of a childish affection, were universally attributed to incestuous love. On a sudden, by some base intrigues of a steward and a nurse, this excessive fondness was converted into an irreconcilable quarrel. The debates of the emperor and his sister were not long confined within the walls of the palace, and as the Gothic soldiers adhered to their queen, the city of Ravenna was agitated with bloody and dangerous tumults, which could only be appeased by the force or voluntary retreat of Placidia and her children. The royal exiles landed at Constantinople soon after the marriage of Theodosius, during the festival of the Persian victories. They retreated with kindness and magnificence, but as the statutes of the Emperor Constantius had been rejected by the Eastern court, the title of Augusta could not decently be allowed to his widow. Within a few months after the arrival of Placidia, a swift messenger announced the death of Honorius, the consequence of a dropsy. But the important secret was not divulged till the necessary orders had been dispatched for a march of a large body of troops to the coast of Dalmatia. The shops and the gates of Constantinople remained shut during 7 days, and the loss of a foreign prince, who could neither be esteemed nor regretted, was celebrated with loud and affected demonstrations of the public grief. While the ministers of Constantinople deliberated, the vacant throne of Honorius was usurped by the ambition of a stranger. The name of the rebel was John. He filled the confidential office of primicerius, or principal secretary, and history has attributed his character more virtues than can be easily reconciled with the violation of the most sacred duty. Elated by the submission of Italy, and the hope of an alliance with the Huns, John presumed to insult, by an embassy, the majesty of the Eastern emperor. But when he understood that his agents had been banished, imprisoned, and at length chased away with deserved ignominy, John prepared to assert by arms the injustice of his claims. In such a cause, the grandson of the great Theodosius should have marched in person, but the young emperor was easily diverted, by his physicians, from so rash and hazardous a design. and the conduct of the Italian expedition was prudently entrusted to Ardaburius and his son Asper, who had already signalized their valor against the Persians. It was resolved that Ardaburius should embark with the infantry, whilst Asper, at the head of the cavalry, conducted Placidia and her son Valentinian along the sea-coast of the Adriatic. The march of the cavalry was performed with such active diligence that they surprised without resistance the important city of Aquileia. When the hopes of Asper were unexpectedly confounded by the intelligence that a storm had dispersed the imperial fleet, and that his father, with only 2 galleys, was taken and carried a prisoner into the port of Ravenna. Yet this incident, unfortunate as it might seem, facilitated the conquest of Italy. Ardaburius employed or abused the courteous freedom which he was permitted to enjoy, to revive among the troops a sense of loyalty and gratitude, and as soon as the conspiracy was ripe for execution, he invited by private messages and pressed the approach of Asper. A shepherd, whom the popular credulity transformed into an angel, guided the eastern cavalry by a secret and, it was thought, an impassable road, through the morasses of the Po. The gates of Ravenna, after a short struggle, were thrown open, and the defenceless tyrant was delivered to the mercy, or rather the cruelty, of the conquerors. His right hand was first cut off, and, after he had been exposed, mounted on an ass, to the public derision, John was beheaded in the circus of Aquileia. The Emperor Theodosius, when he received the news of the victory, interrupted the horse races, and singing, as he marched through the streets, a suitable psalm, conducted his people from the hippodrome to the church, where he spent the remainder of the day in grateful devotion. In a monarchy, which according to various precedents might be considered as elective or hereditary or patrimonial, it was impossible that the intricate claims of female and collateral succession should be clearly defined. And Theodosius, by the right of consanguinity or conquest, might have reigned the sole legitimate emperor of the Romans. For a moment, perhaps, his eyes were dazzled by the prospect of unbounded sway, but this indolent temper gradually acquiesced in the dictates of sound policy. He contented himself with the possession of the East, and wisely relinquished the laborious task of waging a distant and doubtful war against the barbarians beyond the Alps, or of securing the obedience of the Italians and Africans, whose minds were alienated by the irreconcilable differences of language and interest. Instead of listening to the voice of ambition, Theodosius resolved to imitate the moderation of his grandfather, and to seat his cousin Valentinian on the throne of the West. The royal infant was distinguished at Constantinople by the title Nobilissimus. He was promoted, before his departure from Thessalonica, to the rank and dignity of Caesar, and after the conquest of Italy, the patrician Helion, by the authority of Theodosius, and in the presence of the Senate, saluted Valentinian III by the name of Augustus, and solemnly invested him with the diadem and the imperial purple. By the agreement of the 3 females who governed the Roman world, the son of Placidia was betrothed to Eudoxia, the daughter of Theodosius and Athenaeus, and as soon as the lover and his bride had attained the age of puberty, this honorable alliance was faithfully accomplished. At the same time, as a compensation perhaps for the expenses of the war, the western Illyricum was detached from the Italian dominions, and yielded to the throne of Constantinople. The Emperor of the East acquired the useful dominion of the rich and maritime province of Dalmatia, and the dangerous sovereignty of Pannonia and Noricum, which had been filled and ravaged above 20 years by a promiscuous crowd of Huns, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Bavarians. Theodosius and Valentinian continued to respect the obligations of their public and domestic alliance, but the unity of the Roman government was finally dissolved. By a positive declaration, the validity of all future laws was limited to the dominions of their peculiar author, unless he should think proper to communicate them, subscribed with his own hand, for the approbation of his independent colleague. Valentinian, when he received the title of Augustus, was no more than 6 years of age, and his long minority was entrusted to the guardian care of a mother, who might assert a female claim to the succession of the Western Empire. Placidia envied, but she could not equal, the reputation and virtues of the wife and sister of Theodosius, the elegant genius of Eudoxia, the wise and successful policy of Pulcheria. The mother of Valentinian was jealous of the power which she was incapable of exercising. She reigned 25 years in the name of her son, and the character of that unworthy emperor gradually countenanced the suspicion that Placidia had enervated his youth by a dissolute education, and studiously diverted his attention from every manly and honorable pursuit. Amidst the decay of military spirit, her armies were commanded by two generals, Aetius and Boniface, who may be deservedly named as the last of the Romans. Their union might have supported a sinking empire. Their discord was the fatal and immediate cause of the loss of Africa. The invasion and defeat of Attila have immortalized the fame of Aetius. And though time has thrown a shade over the exploits of his rival, the defense of Marseilles and the deliverance of Africa attest to the military talents of Count Boniface. In the field of battle, in partial encounters, and single combats, he was still the terror of the barbarians. The clergy, and particularly his friend Augustine, were edified by the Christian piety which had once tempted him to retire from the world. The people applauded his spotless integrity. The army dreaded his equal and inexorable justice, which may be displayed in a very singular example. A peasant, who complained of the criminal intimacy between his wife and a Gothic soldier, was directed to attend his tribunal the following day. In the evening, the count, who had diligently informed himself of the time and place of the assignation, mounted his horse, rode 10 miles into the country, surprised the guilty couple, punished the soldier with instant death, and silenced the complaints of the husband by presenting him, the next morning, with the head of the adulterer. The abilities of Aetius and Boniface might have been usefully employed against their public enemies, in separate and important commands. But the experience of their past conduct should have decided the real favor and confidence of the Empress Placidia. In the melancholy season of her exile and distress, Boniface alone had maintained her cause with unshaken fidelity, and the troops and treasures of Africa had essentially contributed to extinguish the rebellion. The same rebellion had been supported by the zeal and activity of Aetius, who brought an army of 60,000 Huns from the Danube to the confines of Italy for the service of the usurper. The untimely death of John compelled him to accept an advantageous treaty, but he still continued, the subject and the soldier of Valentinian, to entertain a secret, perhaps a treasonable, correspondence with his barbarian allies, whose retreat had been purchased by liberal gifts and more liberal promises. But Aetius possessed an advantage of singular moment in a female reign. He was present. He besieged with artful and assiduous flattery the palace of Ravenna, disguised his dark designs with the mask of loyalty and friendship, and at length deceived both his mistress and his absent rival by a subtle conspiracy, which a weak woman and a brave man could not easily suspect. He had secretly persuaded Placidia to recall Boniface from the government of Africa. He secretly advised Boniface to disobey the imperial summons. To the one, he represented the order as a sentence of death. To the other, he stated the refusal as a signal of revolt. And when the credulous and unsuspectful count had armed the province in his defense, Aetius applauded his sagacity in foreseeing the rebellion, which his own perfidy had excited. A temperate inquiry into the real motives of Boniface would have restored a faithful servant to his duty and to the republic. But the arts of Aetius still continued to betray and to inflame, and the count was urged by persecution to embrace the most desperate counsels. The success with which he eluded or repelled the first attacks could not inspire a vain confidence, that at the head of some loose, disorderly Africans, he should be able to withstand the regular forces of the West, commanded by a rival, whose military character it was impossible for him to despise. After some hesitation, the last struggles of prudence and loyalty, Boniface dispatched a trusty friend to the court, or rather the camp of Gonderic, king of the Vandals, with the proposal of strict alliance, and the offer of an advantageous and perpetual settlement. After the retreat of the Goths, the authority of Honorius had obtained a precarious establishment in Spain, except only in the province of Galicia, where the Suevi and the Vandals had fortified their camps in mutual discord and hostile independence. The Vandals prevailed, and their adversaries were besieged in the Nervasian hills, between Leon and Oviedo, till the approach of Canesterius compelled, or rather provoked, the victorious barbarians to remove the scene of the war to the plains of Bitca. The rapid progress of the Vandals soon acquired a more effectual opposition, and the master general Castinus marched against them with a numerous army of Romans and Goths. Vanquished in battle by an inferior army, Castinus fled with dishonor to Tarragona, and this memorable defeat, which has been represented as the punishment, was most probably the effect of his rash presumption. Seville and Cartagena became the reward, or rather the prey, of the ferocious conquerors, and the vessels which they found in the harbor of Cartagena might easily transport them to the Isles of Majorca or Minorca, where the Spanish fugitives, as in secure recess, had vainly concealed their families and their fortunes. The experience of navigation, and perhaps the prospects of Africa, encouraged the Vandals to accept the invitation which they received from Count Boniface, and the death of Gonderic served only to forward and animate the bold enterprise. In the room of a prince not conspicuous for any superior powers of the mind or body, they acquired his bastard brother, the terrible Genseric, a name which, in the destruction of the Roman Empire, has deserved an equal rank with the names of Alaric and Attila. The king of the Vandals is described to have been of a middle stature, with a lameness in one leg, which he had contracted by an accidental fall from his horse. His slow and cautious speech seldom declared the deep purposes of his soul. He disdained to imitate the luxury of the vanquished, but he indulged the sterner passions of anger and revenge. The ambition of Genseric was without bounds and without scruples, and the warrior could dexterously employ the dark engines of policy to solicit the allies who might be useful to his success, or to scatter among his enemies the seeds of hatred and contention. Almost in the moment of his departure he was informed that Hermanric, king of the Suevi, had presumed to ravage the Spanish territories, which he was resolved to abandon. Impatient of the insult, Genseric pursued the hasty retreat of the Suevi as far as Merida, precipitated the king and his army into the river Anas, and calmly returned to the seashore to embark his victorious troops. The vessels which transported the Vandals over the modern Straits of Gibraltar, a channel only 12 miles in breadth, were furnished by the Spaniards, who anxiously wished their departure, and by the African general, who had implored their formidable assistance. Our fancy, so long accustomed to exaggerate and multiply the martial swarms of barbarians that seemed to issue from the north, will perhaps be surprised by the account of the army which Genseric mustered on the coast of Mauritania. The Vandals, who in 20 years had penetrated from the Elbe to Mount Atlas, were united under the command of their warlike king, and he reigned with equal authority over the Alani, who had passed, with the term of human life, from the cold of Scythia to the excessive heat of an African climate. The hopes of the bold enterprise had excited many brave adventurers of the Gothic nation, and many desperate provincials were tempted to repair their fortunes by the same means which had occasioned their ruin. Yet this various multitude amounted only to 50,000 effective men, and though Genseric artfully magnified his apparent strength by appointing 80 chiliarchs, or commanders of thousands, the fallacious increase of old men, of children, and of slaves would scarcely have swelled his army to the number of 80,000 persons. But his own dexterity, and the discontents of Africa, soon fortified the Vandal powers, by the accession of numerous and active allies. The parts of Mauritania which border on the great desert in the Atlantic Ocean were filled with a fierce and untraceable race of men, whose savage temper had been exasperated, rather than reclaimed, by their dread of the Roman arm. The wondering Moors, as they gradually ventured to approach the seashore and the camp of the Vandals, must have viewed with terror and astonishment the dress, the armor, the martial pride and discipline of the unknown strangers, who had landed on their coast, and the fair complexions of the blue-eyed warriors of Germany formed a very singular contrast with the swarthy and olive hue which is derived from the neighborhood of the torrid zone. After the first difficulties had in some measure been removed, which arose from the mutual ignorance of their respective language, the Moors, regardless of any future consequence, embraced the alliance of their enemies of Rome, and a crowd of naked savages rushed from the woods and the valleys of Mount Atlas to satiate their revenge on the polished tyrants, who had injuriously expelled them from the native sovereignty of the land. The persecution of the Donatists was an event not less favorable to the designs of Genseric. 17 years before he landed in Africa, a public conference was held at Carthage by the order of the magistrate. The Catholics were satisfied that, after the invincible reasons which they had alleged, the obstinacy of the schismatics must be inexcusable and voluntary, and the Emperor Honorius was persuaded to inflict the most rigorous penalties on a faction which had so long abused his patience and clemency. 300 bishops, with many thousands of the inferior clergy, were torn from their churches, stripped of their ecclesiastical possessions, banished to the islands, and proscribed by the laws, if they presumed to conceal themselves in the provinces of Africa. Their numerous congregations, both in the cities and in the country, were deprived of the rights of citizens, and of the exercise of religious worship. A regular scale of fines from 10 to 200 pounds of silver was curiously ascertained, according to the distinction of rank and fortune, to punish the crime of assisting at a schismatic conventicle. And if the fine had been levied 5 times, without subduing the obstinacy of the offender, his future punishment was referred to the discretion of the imperial court. By these severities, which obtained the warmest approbation of St. Augustine, great numbers of Donatists were reconciled to the Catholic Church. But the fanatics, who still preserved in their opposition, were provoked to madness and despair. The distracted country was filled with tumult and bloodshed. The armed troops of circumcillions alternatively pointed their rage against themselves, or against their adversaries, and the calendar of martyrs received on both sides a considerable augmentation. Under these circumstances, Genseric, a Christian, but an enemy of the Orthodox communion, showed himself to the Donatists as a powerful deliverer, from whom they might reasonably expect the repeal of the odious and oppressive edicts of the Roman emperors. The conquest of Africa was facilitated by the active zeal or the secret favor of a domestic faction. The wanton outrages against the church and the clergy, of which the Vandals are accused, may be fairly imputed to the fanaticism of their allies, and the intolerant spirit which disgraced the triumph of Christianity, contributed to the loss of the most important province of the West. The court and the people were astonished by the strange intelligence, that a virtuous hero, after so many favors and so many services, had renounced his allegiance, and invited the barbarians to destroy the province entrusted to his command. The friends of Boniface, who still believed that his criminal behavior might be excused by some honorable motive, solicited, during the absence of Aetius, a free conference with the Count of Africa, and Darius, an officer of high distinction, was named for the important embassy. In their first interview at Carthage, the imaginary provocations were mutually explained. The opposite letters of Aetius were produced and compared, and the fraud was easily detected. Placidia and Boniface lamented their fatal error, and the count had sufficient magnanimity to confide in the forgiveness of his sovereign, or to expose his head to her future resentment. His repentance was fervent and sincere, but he soon discovered that it was no longer in his power to restore the edifice which he had shaken to its foundations. Carthage and the Roman garrisons returned with their general to the allegiance of the Valentinian, but the rest of Africa was still distracted with war and faction, and the inexorable king of the Vandals, disdaining all terms of accommodation, sternly refused to relinquish the possession of his prey. The band of veterans who marched under the standard of Boniface, and his hasty levies of provincial troops, were defeated with considerable loss. The victorious barbarians, insulted the open country. Carthage, Cirta, and Hippo Regius were the only cities that appeared to rise above the general inundation. The long and narrow tract of the African coast was filled with frequent monuments of Roman art and magnificence, and the respective degrees of improvement might be accurately measured by the distance from Carthage and the Mediterranean. A simple reflection will impress every thinking mind with the clearest idea of fertility and cultivation. The country was extremely populous. The inhabitants reserved a liberal subsistence for their own use, and the annual exportation, particularly of wheat, was so regular and plentiful that Africa deserved the name of the common granary of Rome and of mankind. On a sudden, the 7 fruitful provinces, from Tangier to Tripoli, were overwhelmed by the invasion of the Vandals, whose destructive rage had perhaps been exaggerated by popular animosity, religious zeal, and extravagant declamation. War, in its fairest form, implies a perpetual violation of humanity and justice, and the hostility of the barbarians are inflamed by the fierce and lawless spirit which incessantly disturbs their peaceful and domestic society. The Vandals, where they found resistance, seldom gave quarter, and the deaths of their valiant countrymen were expiated by the ruin of cities under whose walls they had fallen. Careless of the distinctions of age or sex or rank, they employed every species of indignity and torture to force from the captives a discovery of their hidden wealth. The stern policy of Genseric justified his frequent examples of military execution. He was not always the master of his own passions, or of those of his followers, and the calamities of war were aggravated by the licentiousness of the Moors and the fanaticism of the Donatists. Yet I shall not easily be persuaded that it was the common practice of the Vandals to extirpate the olives and other fruit trees of a country where they intended to settle. Nor can I believe that it was an unusual stratagem to slaughter great numbers of their prisoners before the walls of a besieged city, for the sole purpose of infecting the air and producing a pestilence of which they themselves must have been the first victims. The generous mind of Count Boniface was tortured by the exquisite distress of beholding the ruin which he had occasioned, and whose rapid progress he was unable to check. After the loss of a battle he retired to Hippo Regius, where he was immediately besieged by an enemy who considered him as the real bulwark of Africa. The maritime colony of Hippo, about 200 miles westward of Carthage, had formerly acquired the distinguishing epithet of Regius, from the residence of Numidian kings, and some remains of trade and populousness still adhere to a modern city, which is known in Europe by the corrupted name of Bona. The military labors and anxious reflections of Count Boniface were alleviated by the edifying conversation of his friend St. Augustine, till that bishop, the light and pillar of the Catholic Church, was gently released in the 3rd month of the siege, and in the 76th year of his age, from the actual and impending calamities of his country. The youth of Augustine had been stained by the vices and errors which he so ingeniously confesses, but from the moment of his conversion to that of his death, the manners of the Bishop of Hippo were pure and austere, and the most conspicuous of his virtues was an ardent zeal against the heretics of every denomination, the Manichaeans, the Donatists, and the Pelagians, against whom he waged a perpetual controversy. When the city, some months after his death, was burnt by the Vandals, the library was fortunately saved, which contained his voluminous writings, 232 separate books or treatises on theological subjects, besides a complete exposition of the Psalter and the Gospel, and a copious magazine of epistles and homilies. According to the judgment of the most impartial critics, the superficial learning of Augustine was confined to the Latin language, and his style, though sometimes animated by the eloquence of passion, is usually clouded by false and affected rhetoric. But he possessed a strong, capacious, argumentative mind. He boldly sounded the dark abyss of grace, predestination, free will, and original sin, and the rigid system of Christianity which he framed or restored has been entertained with public applause and secret reluctance by the Latin Church. End of chapter 33, part 1.